Griddlebone, from the World of P.A.W.S. by Debbie Manber Kupfer.
Why? Why, oh Papa? Why have you avoided me all these years? And why are you finally meeting me now?
I had reasons, Quetzal. Reasons.
Reasons aren't good enough. Details. I want details. There are so many things you never told me.
I was embarrassed, Finny. I always felt I could do more. Could have saved them all if I hadn't been so blind.
You saved me.
Said Finny.
And Jacob. You saved Jacob.
2 cats. Just 2 cats, Finny. And there were hundreds of werecats.
Tell me what happened, oh Papa.
Griddlebone looked up.
There were tears in his eyes.
Where to start, though?
Start at the beginning.
You know, I was the first, said Griddlebone. An early experiment.
Finny nodded, and Griddlebone continued.
The Germans were seeking a better soldier, a better fighting machine. They hired a scientist to help them with their work, the renowned Dr. Wechsler. He was considered a revolutionary in the field of genetics. In his laboratory, he created mutants by blending feline genes with humans. He chose the cat because it was the easiest carnivore to obtain. It was simple to take an alley cat off the streets. No one missed it, except the other cats, of course. But who cared about them? They wanted a predator, one that they could teach to kill for them, one that their enemies wouldn't expect. But cats are fickle creatures, and intelligent too. I woke up in that laboratory, outwardly appearing as I had been. A young man of 20, but inwardly I could feel the change that had been wrought. Could feel the new feline essence inside me. The scientist wanted a demonstration to show the Gestapo chief who was visiting that day. Yes, I decided I would give him a demonstration. The Gestapo chief paced in front of me. You say he can change? Yes, sir. He turned to me smiling. So let's see it, Herr Griddlebone. I concentrated, understanding instinctively what to do. Inside me, I had retained the memories of the old street cat that had been used in my creation. My body contracted, and I became a presumably harmless house cat, a large gray tabby. Marvelous, said the Gestapo chief, clapping his hands. He will make a wonderful spy, but maybe not such a good fighter. You are working on others, I hope? Vienna Zoo is at your service. Take whatever you need from there. I fancy perhaps a leopard or a tiger. Oh, I thought. A tiger's what you want? I might be able to do something about that. As soon as the Nazi's back was turned, I pounced. In the air, my body changed, quickly growing 10 times my original size. My claws lengthened and sharpened into dangerous weapons, and my teeth became vicious canines. That's for my mother and father, I bellowed, and I sunk my teeth into the Gestapo chief's flesh. The rest of the Nazis in the room were cowards. They ran from me, screaming, and I had no difficulty escaping from the laboratory. Once outside, I shrunk back down into regular cat size, my favorite form from then on, and ran out into the streets of Vienna. I had no clear idea what to do or where to go. My family had been killed on the day I was taken, but the Nazis had given me a gift. In my cat form, I could easily blend into the shadows. Nobody suspected a cat after all. My attack on the Gestapo chief did not deter the Nazis from their experiments. If anything, it empowered them. If one small cat could create such chaos, what could a whole army of shapeshifting carnivores achieve? I was making friends with the street cats, but sometimes my new friends would go missing, just as they had when I lived as a Jew. Some of the street animals were taken for food by ordinary citizens. The war years had led to shortages of meat. But others were taken by the Nazis so they could continue their experiments. My first rescue was a glorious thing. I meowed at the door of the laboratory, making myself smaller and inconsequential. A lab assistant let me in, smirking. Well, we could always do with another cat. though this one doesn't look like he has a lot of fight in him. Little did they know. Around the room were a number of cages. Some contained cats, yet to be used in the experiments. Others contained the results of previous experiments. Strange were creatures, cats of all sizes and shapes, some grotesquely disfigured as the scientist tried to improve his mutations. The lab assistant saw me as no threat, just a street moggy, so they gave me a saucer of milk and left me loose on the floor of the lab. Needs a little fattening up before we can use him, one of them said. I lapped my milk and waited for my opportunity. I wandered around the room, sniffing hither and thither, pretending to explore, but actually, I was speaking the locks, with my mind. When the scientist made me, he truly didn't understand the power he was unleashing. The addition of feline genes to my genetic makeup gave me powers I could never have dreamed of before. Telepathy, of course, for that is how I'm speaking to you now, and also a limited telekinesis. The locks were easy to pick. I merely had to visualize the mechanism inside, and they simply slipped open. I prepared the residents for escape, reaching out to each mind with my whiskers. All could help free themselves, I explained. The werecats and the true cats. Everyone had claws and teeth after all. On that day, we killed 5 men in the Nazi laboratory, all but the scientist. The scientist begged for his life. We considered this and decided to be lenient. He could be useful, so we spared his life and brought him with us. We wondered if we could trust him, of course, but he seemed to prefer to be on the winning side. We settled into Glocken Street, making our headquarters in the abandoned warehouse. Dr. Wechsler, as you already know, turned out to be more than he first appeared. He wasn't just a brilliant scientist, but also a talented magician who placed wards around our warehouse home that became the headquarters for Vienna P.A.W.S. We started paying attention to the raids of the Jewish homes in Vienna. I'd watched Esther for months now and befriended her in my cat form. I knew it was only a matter of time until the Nazis would come and take away her family. I scouted the streets every morning at dawn until the day came. That night, I waited in the shadows, then padded silently across the cobbles of the dark Vienna street. It was deserted, but I knew it would soon be filled with footsteps and cries, gunshots, and blood. They were slated to come at dawn to cleanse this last Jewish neighborhood of its vermin so that the proper folk of Vienna could finally live judenfrei. Inside the darkened houses, the residents huddled in fear. The news of the transport had only come hours before, and some still couldn't believe it. I believed it, though, and had stationed my werecats all around the silent streets, where we waited for dawn. The residents of the street had been fooling themselves for months, believing that this one insignificant street could survive in its own little bubble, that somehow God would protect them. They readied themselves with what few valuables they had left. Maybe they could still bribe the Nazi soldiers. Maybe there was still a way out. I flexed my claws as I waited in the shadows. I wished I could rescue them all, but I knew we could only take one. They needed to be the right age too. A teenager would be good, strong enough to fight, strong enough to survive the turning. As the first ray of light caught the cobblestones, I felt the footsteps echoing down the street. Soon, my tail swished back and forth in anticipation. Within minutes, the first soldier came into view. I was all but invisible to the soldiers, my mottled gray coat blending perfectly with the cold gray street. At the same time, as the first soldiers appeared on foot, a silver gray truck arrived on the street and parked in front of the buildings, waiting for its human cargo. As the Gestapo soldiers marched past my hiding place, I longed to dig my claws into their ankles, to hear them scream with pain. Not yet, Griddlebone. Not yet. The soldiers reached the first house. They banged on the doors. Juden, Herios! Schnell! Everybody out of there! Quickly! At first there was silence. I held my breath waiting. And then, slowly, they came out, squinting in the light of the dawn. They had been inside for so long sitting in the darkness. They looked like ancient patriarchs held in suspended animation from biblical times. The man had a long white beard and was wearing a prayer shawl. The woman had her head covered and bent. She held out something to the soldiers. I stole in closer to get a better look. It was a silver candlestick. The frightened woman offered it to the soldier. The soldier laughed. He grabbed it and shoved it in his bag, then roughly pulled the old woman forward. She tripped and fell into the hard cobbled street. The soldier kicked her, and she cried out in pain. Throughout this, her husband was bobbing up and down in prayer, praying that God would take them before these Nazis did. His prayers were not answered, and the soldiers forced the old couple into the waiting truck. More soldiers arrived now and pushed their way into the buildings. The next house held a young family, a mother and a father, with two small terrified children. The mother clutched a baby girl in her arms. As they boarded the truck, the baby started crying. The nearest soldier grabbed her from her mother's arms and flung her with full force into the solid concrete wall. The baby stopped crying. The mother screamed. A Nazi soldier silenced the mother with his gun. The father and his remaining children climbed quietly into the truck, trying not to look back. I stalked over to the baby. I nudged her gently with my nose, but it was too late. And in any case, how could my clan have been able to care for a baby? We could barely find enough food for our own kittens these days. I continued to watch the parade of Jews being evicted from their buildings. They had been told they were being rehoused, that their homes were needed for the war effort. As patriotic Austrians, surely they understood? I knew that most of these Jews would end up in the concentration camps, if they even survived the transport. A second shot filled the air. A young man this time. He tried to run, but the soldier had used him for target practice. I itched to move against the soldier now, but held back and continued watching and biding my time. There she was, straggling at the back of another family, Esther, the girl I had been watching for the last few weeks. She looked around with wary eyes and caught sight of me on the concrete of the street. I had been her friend. She would sneak out and give me scraps to eat from her own meager portion. It was strange. She wasn't scared, despite the soldiers and the guns and the screaming. She held her head upright and stared straight into the eyes of the Nazi soldiers. Yes, I thought, watching her, I've chosen rightly. Esther is a strong survivor. Silently, I sent my message to the rest of the clan members who were waiting in the shadows. They moved into the previously agreed positions on the street corners. They readied themselves to pounce. Each cat started out as an insignificant street cat, but slowly they began changing and growing into wildcats that resembled tigers more than tabbies. On my signal, they launched themselves onto the Nazi soldiers, ripping at them with fearsome teeth and claws. The soldiers shrieked in fear and fired at the cats, but the felines were far swifter than any of the men. They dodged the bullets with ease, dancing around them, taunting their enemies with their agility. Within just a few minutes, 2 soldiers had fallen to the werecats. The remaining cut their losses and quickly shoved the terrified Jews into the transport. They jumped onto the truck and fled. While the rest of the werecats attacked the soldiers, I beckoned to the girl. Instinctively, she followed me into the shadows and ran after me through the streets until the howling and screaming was far behind us. Finally, we arrived at the old warehouse in Glocken Street. I stopped at the door and nudged it with my nose. It creaked open and the 2 of us walked in. The room was filled with yowls and growls and laughter. It was a strange mix that met Esther's eyes. There were many different cats interspersed with humans, mostly children about her age. They were sitting in groups, some playing cards, games or chess, others just talking. She turned to me.
Where are we?
She asked. Headquarters, I replied, my voice echoing in her head. It isn't much, but it's our home.
What about my family?
Asked Esther.
My friends?
I'm sorry, I replied. The Nazis have taken them on the transport. There was nothing we could do. I would love to save everyone, but we cannot. We were lucky if we rescue one person from each transport.
Where will they take them?
She asked. To the ghetto, but there are rumors that they don't stay there for long. The Nazis have set up concentration camps, and most that enter those never leave.
Just for the Jews?
Said Esther. Mostly, but not all. Also the gypsies, the communists, the homosexuals, anyone that Hitler doesn't deem to be pure.
And we can't do anything?
We do what we can. Everyone here has lost family.
Everyone?
Asked Esther, looking at the mix of animals and humans in the room. Everyone, answered Griddlebone. I then told Esther my story as I have told you and asked if she wished to join us. I explained to her what it meant, about the procedure that would turn her into a werecat. She agreed readily, as I knew she would, as I had seen the fire in her eyes. The next day, I took her to meet Dr. Wechsler. The white-haired doctor sat at a table drinking a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. He looked up as we entered. Ah, Griddlebone, you have returned. Gut, sehr gut. And this is our new recruit? Yes, Herr Wechsler. The scientist sized up Esther with critical eyes. And she understands the dangers? She has been informed. Herr Wechsler sighed. We have lost too many, he said. And still Hitler continues transporting more to the camps. That is why, Herr Wechsler, I said. Why we have to keep trying, keep recruiting. Do we have a volunteer? Asked Wechsler quietly. Yes, there are many cats waiting to join our ranks. So be it. Let me finish my coffee and we will begin. Around a month after she was turned, Esther insisted on returning to the street where she had grown up. I hadn't wanted her to go. There was nothing left there after all. But she snuck out in the early hours of the morning one day. I trailed behind, unnoticed. I watched her run through the streets of Vienna. It had been raining, and the cobbles were slick beneath her paws. This was the first time she had been outside of the headquarters since her transformation. I knew she was restless and wanted to explore in her new feline form and understood. Having been in hiding for so long, it must have felt amazing to be free, to be out on the street, and feel the wind ruffling her fur. She was drawn to visit her old street, but it was deserted now, abandoned. The soldiers had taken everyone but her on the transport, and their homes had been ransacked. She looked for something worth saving, but there was nothing. She sighed. Maybe it was better that way? After all, she would not have been able to take anything but the smallest memento back with her. She walked more slowly on her way back to the warehouse, subdued from her visit to her home, which was no longer her home. She thought about her family and friends that had been taken. The Werecats in the headquarters had talked to her about the raids we had carried out, the grand rescues from the concentration camps. I met Esther on her way back to the warehouse. There were tears in her eyes, but also determination.
There was nothing left, Griddlebone,
she said.
I lived my whole life in that street, but there was nothing left.
I'm sorry, Esther, I said.
Sorry's not good enough. I want to help. I'm a werecat now. Take me, Griddlebone. I want to fight.
It is dangerous, Esther. You are young, inexperienced.
Then teach me.
I watched the guard circle the perimeter of the fence that night. Every so often, he would stop and stare into the darkness surrounding the concentration camps. I wondered if he could see our eyes glowing in the dark, blinking on and off like 100 restless stars. Could he hear the persistent hissing too? Did he think we were venomous snakes waiting to attack? He was not so far off. The guard visibly shuddered, whether from fear or the frigid cold of the night, I couldn't be sure. But I was certain that he longed for his shift to be over so he could go inside the soldiers' barracks and warm himself by the fire. The inmates of the concentration camp had no such luxury as a fire. They shivered in their raggedy cotton pajamas. Arbeit macht frei. Those words were on the front of the gates of the concentration camp, But the inmates understood it was not work that made you free. It was death. Death was the only escape through those gates, or at least, that's what they believed. I stood at the edge of the forest with Esther. We had traced Esther's father to this place. There were probably others she knew from Vienna behind these gates, but the young Werecat understood we wouldn't be able to rescue them all. She also had been made to understand the danger. In every such raid, we always lost Werecats. It was the risk we took. Esther watched the guard circle by the gate for the third time. Swiftly, she moved forward, pushed herself through the iron bars, and walked up to the guard. She tried to make herself look as small and pathetic as possible. "Katze, little cat. Where did you come from?" Esther looked up at the guard and gave a plaintive meow. "Oh, are you hungry, Katzel? Well, I've nearly finished my shift. If you stay with me, I'll take you back to the barracks. Maybe I can find you a few scraps." Esther purred. She was in. It was only a matter of time. I waited for Esther's signal. I was tense, and the fur on my back was fluffed up. All around the perimeter of the camp, my werecats waited. They would be responsible for the distraction, the attack on the camp guards. I flexed my claws. I was aching for a fight and growled involuntarily. At midnight, there was a change of guard, and I watched Esther disappear into the barracks. Please God, let her be okay. I had grown fond of this girl in the last few months. I had lost so much already. I couldn't bear to lose Esther as well. Later, she told me what happened inside the barracks. At first, the guards fawned over the little cat. They gave her a saucer of milk and petted her. "But you'd better hide her before the commandant sees her." "Why? Don't you know? He hates cats." "Scared, more like. I heard his brother was killed by one." "Aha. I thought I believed I know who his brother was." "Nonsense. She's harmless. It's just stories, that's all. I've heard he was a drunkard, that Gestapo officer. Those soldiers were just covering for him with the story of the cat. Still, I would hide her. Fair enough. Whatever you say. Here, kitty, come over here." They placed her saucer of milk in a storage cupboard along with a few scraps and ushered Esther inside. She mewed in confusion as they shut the door, continuing her act as a poor little kitten. Then, when she was sure they were no longer paying attention to her, she sent me a message through her whiskers. "I'm in," she said. Gradually, the voices of the soldiers pettered off as one by one they went to sleep. Esther finished her meal and took a cat nap while she waited. Outside the perimeter of the fence, the rest of my werecats closed in on the camp. Each was waiting and waiting for the sign from me. At dawn, the commandant rose from his special quarters and walked into the guards' barracks. Esther awoke instantly as he entered and sent me a quick message. Even through the closet door, she could smell him. He reeked of expensive cologne and arrogance. She bristled and sat motionless in the closet, listening carefully. The commandant greeted the soldiers gruffly. The soldiers had all but forgotten about the little cat in the closet, but the commandant could sense Esther's presence almost immediately. He walked around the room, sniffing the air, and then came to a stop directly in front of the closet door. "I suspect we have a rat," he said, and reached for the handle of the door, "or else a cat." As he opened the door, Esther darted out beneath his feet. "Katze, Katze! Catch her quickly! Schnell, schnell!" The guards rushed around trying to reach the cat, but she was too quick and darted out into the compound, running towards the barracks that held the Jews. She screamed a message to me as she ran. "Please come quickly, Griddlebone! They're nearly upon me!" At the doorway to the barracks, an inmate was looking out. Esther was horrified when she saw the skeleton-like man in front of her, wearing nothing but flimsy cotton pajamas decorated with a yellow Star of David. "Katze," said the Jew, and he smiled. It was clear that he liked cats. Esther gazed into the man's sunken eyes. She couldn't bear it anymore. Disobeying every lesson she'd learned from me, she shifted her body back into human form and ran to the man. "Papa!" she screamed.
We've come to save you!
The man looked confused. Esther, how is this possible? All around them now, there were growls and gunshots. Esther clung to her father, desperate to protect him. The commandant was marching towards them. You! He screamed, pointing at Esther. You're nothing but a child, a mere kitten. I had creeped up behind the man and watched Esther's reunion with her father. That may be true, I said. The commandant swung around, but I'm not. With that, I expanded and grew until I was 10 feet high. I extended my claws and pounced on the commandant with the full power of a raging saber-toothed tiger. I knocked the Nazi to the ground and sank my teeth into his chest. Never underestimate a cat, I said as the last light went from the commandant's eyes. It was glorious. As I sunk my teeth into the flesh of the commandant, he squealed and begged me for mercy. I laughed at his face.
What happened to Esther's father?
Asked Finny. He survived. We took him to a safe house. He even was reunited with Esther and Rachel after the war.
I think I remember Tante Esther,
said Finny.
She visited when...
Yes, after the war, she left Vienna with her boyfriend and traveled the world. She never wanted to settle down. She still visited occasionally and sent postcards. I wish she had stayed away and not returned the night. I broke off, unable to complete the words. I would have to tell Finny soon. The time was running out, but not just yet. Finny broke my thoughts with a new question.
And Mama? When did you meet Rachel?
Asked Finny. Well, your mama came out of Auschwitz. It was the very last rescue the Werecats carried out just months before the war ended. I almost lost control when I saw the conditions of the Jews within the camp. I wanted to rear up and kill as many Nazi soldiers as I could, but Esther held me back. Her older sister, Rachel, was supposed to be in this camp. It was the first time since she'd rescued her father several years ago that she'd located a living family member. In cat form, she walked from barracks to barracks, peering in through each door, gazing at the gaunt skeletal inmates moaning in their sleep. She'd almost given up when she found Rachel tucked into a lower bunk in flimsy striped pajamas, her head shaved, and shivering in her sleep under a single thin gray blanket. Esther jumped up onto the bed and nudged her sister's cheek with a tentative paw. Her eyes opened, and she stared in wonder at the small tabby cat that gazed directly at her eyes with sadness in its eyes.
Where did you come from, Kitty?
Esther patted her sister's mouth with her paw to silence her. She sent me a mental message. I found her. She jumped off the bed and looked back at her sister, willing her to follow. Rachel was very weak, but she slowly climbed out of bed and followed the cat out of the barracks. Outside, there were sounds of gunshots and growls. My werecats were attacking the soldiers. No longer innocent street cats, we had grown to the size of tigers. The Nazi guards were terrified. There had been stories of wildcats that had attacked other camps, but this was the first and the only time the cats ever entered Auschwitz. 3 werecats were lost in the fight, but not before killing 6 Nazi soldiers. And Esther, in cat form, led her sister out of the camp via a small hole in the fence that I had cut for her with my razor-sharp claws. They stumbled through the forest for miles. Esther showed the way in her cat form and urged her sister to follow her. Finally, Rachel could go no further and collapsed exhausted on the ground. Esther came to her then and slowly changed back into human form and embraced her sister. They spent the rest of the night snuggled under a blanket that Esther had packed into the small backpack that she'd placed on her shoulder before shifting into her cat form. Rachel had many questions and was overjoyed to hear that their father had survived. The rest of their family had not been so lucky. Before Rachel had been transferred to Auschwitz, she had watched each of the remaining family members, their mother, aunt, and their 2 brothers, perish in the previous camp. 3 had died of typhoid that was rife in the camp, and their brother Rolf died at the hands of a Nazi soldier. He'd been trying to protect his sister and had paid for that mistake with his life. Rachel had actually been hopeful when she'd been transferred to Auschwitz.
Auschwitz had the reputation of being not just a death camp, but a work camp too. If they deemed her healthy enough to work, she might yet survive. And she did. She struggled on despite the abysmal conditions and treatment and hid her growing afflictions. She carried the torch of survival and wanted to survive so she could bear witness to the atrocities she had seen, so that Hitler and the Nazis did not win this war. She had believed she was the last one left of her family, but now there was Esther, impossibly alive and carrying the tale that she'd rescued their father. It all seemed fuzzy like a dream. Had she been hallucinating when she'd seen the cat? And what about the huge wild cat she'd seen in the camp? How had she arrived out here in the woods with her sister? Where would they go now? After they had slept, Esther led her sister through the forest to a resistance camp. It was a strange place filled with howls and squawks, along with laughter and urgent conversation. Esther explained to her that this was an outpost of P.A.W.S, the partnership of Animagi, wearers, and shapeshifters, and that she herself was a werecat now. Rachel tried to take it all in, but part of her still believed she was delirious, or maybe she had died back in the cold bunk in Auschwitz, and this was all a weird representation of afterlife. She confided all of this to me later, and that she had always believed that she would be reunited with her loved ones after she crossed over. She remembered how her sister had befriended an old tabby street cat just a month or so before they'd been taken by the soldiers. In fact, when she thought about it, she swore she'd seen the same tabby in the camp waiting by the hole in the fence. Of course she had. That was me, and that was my first glimpse of your mama, who would later become the love of my life. For 3 days, Rachel slept fitfully in the resistance camp. She was running a fever, and the camp healer, an old animagus called Herr Waffel, gave her potions to calm and strengthen her whenever she awoke. On the 3rd day, she opened her eyes and saw her sister watching her. "Welcome back," said Esther. "Herr Waffel says that your fever is down. You're going to be all right." "This may sound silly," said Rachel, "but is he a toad? I swore I saw a toad watching over me while I was sick." "He is indeed an animagus that takes the form of a toad." "Animagus? What's that?" "Animagi are magicians that have learned how to change their form to one of an animal. Healers are often reptiles or amphibians, like toads or snakes. They sometimes use their own venom in their healing potions." "Are you an animagus too, Esther? I've seen you change into a cat, or at least I think I have. It is all so fuzzy." "Yes, I'm a cat, but no, I'm not an animagus. I'm a werecat. I chose to transition once I joined P.A.W.S so that I could help the resistance. When you are well, you can do the same if you wish, though you have to be much stronger to be able to bear the transformation." Rachel looked at her sister. Yes, there was something changed in her appearance. If she looked deeply into her eyes, she felt she could see the cat that dwelt inside her, as if there were 2 separate beings staring out at her, the feline and the human. She still wondered how this could all be possible, but looking around at the multitude of creatures that filled the space, she found it more and more difficult to retain her disbelief. Rachel stayed in the outpost of P.A.W.S for several weeks while she grew stronger. Esther would come and go, sometimes in her human shape and sometimes in her cat form. I also came to visit the camp, came to see Rachel, as I couldn't get her out of my head. I always stayed in my cat form though, and Rachel got used to talking to the large, scraggy tabby cat, who Esther told her was the first werecat. Rachel found herself curiously drawn to me as I was to her. She would watch my comings and goings, but found herself tongue-tied whenever I came by and inquired how she was doing. I could tell she longed to ask me about my story, but remained shy. Eventually, Herr Waffel pronounced her healthy, and Esther and I met with Rachel to discuss her future. I explained the situation as best as I could, praying inside me that she would make the right choice, even though I knew it was selfish of me. "Now, Rachel, now that you have been given a clean bill of health from Herr Waffel, it is time to make a choice. We can either send you on the safe house to be with your father, or you can join us in Vienna and learn the ways of the Werecats." It was tough. Rachel very much wanted to see her father again. She understood that the work of the Werecats were perilous, and that if she chose that direction, she may never get the chance to be reunited with Papa. But on the other hand, she wanted to stay with her sister and was intrigued by my story and wanted to know more. "I will go to Vienna with you," she said. In Vienna, Rachel met with the scientist Herr Wechsler, and her transition to Werecat began. Once she was a cat, she was finally able to talk to me more freely. I told her my history, how I had been taken as a teenager by the Nazis and used in an experiment to genetically alter my body so that I could take the form of a cat. You know, I was meant to be a secret weapon for the Nazis, but the Nazis didn't count on the independence of the cat, that a cat would never be willfully controlled. Finny nodded her head. I told her about the glorious attack in the laboratory, about the Nazi chief I killed, and about the subsequent raids that had grown my force of werecats. I also explained how the scientist had bargained for his life and set to work to strengthen and grow the ranks of the werecats loyal to the resistance. "Yes," agreed Dr. Wechsler. "I prefer to be on the winning side." Over the months that followed, we grew closer. Esther found friends in the warehouse, even a boyfriend. Rachel was happy for her sister and enjoyed seeing her explore her youth despite the limitations of the world around them. And then, the glorious thing. The war ended. Hitler was dead, the Nazis overthrown. There was jubilation among the werecats that spilled out onto the streets of Vienna. Many decided to leave, to search out lost relatives. Esther and Rachel visited their father. The reunion was full of joyful tears. Their father was still very weak and would not live long after the war's end, but still, he got to see his daughters and know they were safe. Esther traveled with her boyfriend. In their cat forms, it was easy to go unnoticed, and they were able to sneak onto trains and boats. I believe you have done similar, Finny, have you not? "Yes, oh Papa. I have been further than I ever would have imagined I could go. All the way to the New World. Though after you are done telling me your story, I think I'm ready to return to Israel if you can help me find a portal." All in good time, Katzel. So while Esther traveled all around Europe and sent picture postcards back to Vienna, Rachel decided to stay on and keep me company. Not many werecats still lived in headquarters. Even the scientist, Herr Wechsler, had disappeared. Rumors abounded that he'd gone to South America, not convinced that he wouldn't be tried as a Nazi war criminal if he were caught. I stayed in Vienna. As I confided in Rachel, I had no other place to go. After I had escaped from the laboratory, the Nazis had taken their revenge on my family and had systematically sought them out and executed each one. I had no one left. Finny stepped forward and put a paw on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, oh Papa." Rachel understood now why I'd been so reluctant to talk before, and as the days turned to months, we grew closer and our relationship deepened. Yet, she'd still never seen me in my human form. She asked me sometimes if I'd forgotten how to transform, but I just shook my head and she let it go. But I could tell she was worried. While she was happy to spend some of her time as a feline, she wasn't ready to take the step to abandon humanity altogether so that she could be with me. But it was wearing her down, I could tell that, and one day, she decided to confront me about it. "Why do you never change?" she asked. I understood immediately what she meant. I'd been thinking about this very same question a lot myself lately, wondering what the future held for me and Rachel. But it had been so long, I didn't know if he could force myself into my old shape anymore. "I don't see the point," I said, though it was not exactly true. "I see the world so much more clearly through the eyes of a cat. I've witnessed so much cruelty from the hands of men. A cat would not ever be capable of such cruelty." Rachel knew I had killed men, granted they were Nazis who had blood on their hands, but nevertheless, men. Were cats and men really so different? I could see the unsaid thoughts written on her face. I don't justify what I did, but I'm scared that if I ever return to human form, I might forget the lessons I have learned as a cat. Would you try just one time for me? I want to look upon your human face. I'm not so sure it would be so pleasing to you. As you can see, I'm a fetching cat, but I was always a rather puny boy. Granted, I am older now, but I do not know how the passing years would translate into my human form. I was just 19 when I was turned, so in human years, I would be close to 30 today. And I am 25, said Rachel. It would be perfect. Maybe, if I am truly 30 in human years, but cats, as you know, age more quickly. For all you know, I could be an old man of 45 under this fur. Much too old for you, Rachel. Surely you'd rather not see that? That is not so old, said Rachel. Please try, just this once for me. I promise I will not judge you. Let me think about it. Okay, but don't think too long. There are other Toms out there, she teased. I did think about it. I liked Rachel, perhaps more than anyone else I'd ever met. I wanted to take the next step into love, but knew I couldn't ask her to do that if I wasn't willing to be with her in both forms. But what would I even look like in my human form? Maybe she'd be repulsed by me. I knew I was a handsome cat, but as a man... That night, I watched her sleeping. She started the night in her feline form curled up in a ball. Yet sometime in the night, she slowly melted back into a girl. I looked at her. She was still thin, but nothing like the living skeleton she'd been when we had first rescued her from Auschwitz. But even in the early days, she'd proved she was strong, far stronger than I thought was possible. She'd embraced the transition with almost the same ease as her sister, and had proved herself a valuable member of P.A.W.S. She appeared fearless on the raid she'd taken part in. I told her I didn't want to be human because of the evil that humans had perpetrated, but there were courageous humans too. As I watched Rachel sleeping, I made my decision. Just once, I thought. Slowly, I transformed, letting my limbs shape and reform. The fur on my body receded, and I felt naked and unprotected. I looked down at my human limbs, at my hands with long white fingers. It felt alien, and I shivered. I remembered how they had forced me out of this form in that laboratory. I remembered the terror of the cat that had been used in the transformation, forced to merge its being with an inferior human. I remembered the pain of the initial transition. Later, when Herr Wechsler came to work for P.A.W.S, he developed more humane ways of carrying out the transition. And it was different then, as the parties involved were willing and wanted to become werecats and take their place in the resistance. Not so for me and the other early experiments. I'd had felinity forced upon me, but I had discovered that despite the initial pain, this was a blessing rather than a curse. This human form seemed so vulnerable, but I had promised Rachel. Carefully, I lay down by her side, put my arms around her, feeling the warmth of her against my body. I wore just a simple undershirt and shorts, glad that at least I wasn't naked. Of course, if I were to stay in this form, I would need clothing, something I hadn't worried about for years, as I'd had my own fur coat. Rachel opened her eyes. Griddlebone? Yes, my love, I said, and covered her mouth with my own. During the months that followed, our relationship flourished. I still spent most of my time in my feline form, and Rachel would join me during the day, and we would roam the streets of Vienna. But at night, I would change into human form and sleep with Rachel in my arms. There was no formal wedding, but when Rachel became pregnant, we invited Esther and her boyfriend to celebrate the birth of our child. Rachel wished her father had been there to see his grandchild, but he'd passed away the year before. The young boy that was born represented a first among the Werecats, the firstborn of Werecat parents. Among werewolves, it was common for a child to transform for the first time during adolescence, so Rachel and I had expected the same. But when our son was just 6 weeks old, I was rudely awakened from a catnap by a tap on my nose. I opened my eyes and saw a ginger and white kitten staring at me.
"Daddy,
Mewed the kitten.
play."
Other werecats that had remained in Vienna also started mating, and soon there was a thriving community. Our son Hans grew, and in turn, met a pretty calico, Gertrude.
"My parents."
Said Finny. Yes,
"I miss them."
I do too. You remember that day when I forced you into Umbri? Finny nodded. I tried, Finny. I tried so hard to protect them. I'm sorry.
There was nothing you could do.
I wonder though.
"One thing I don't understand,"
said Finny.
"how did you get trapped in the village of wood? One would not have thought a werecat."
It began with a mistake, as it always does. After the war, Rachel and I settled down in Vienna. We were the only ones left in headquarters for a while, as the other werecats took advantage of the calm to go exploring and also to search for surviving family members. Slowly though, they started to trickle back and we formed a nice little peacetime community. Rachel and I had kittens, and so did others in the community. It was a good time, and we became complacent. We forgot about the wolves, but the werewolf leader, Alistair, had not forgotten about us. Now the war was over, he sensed the vacuum left by the departing Nazis. It would be a good time to increase his range of power. He visited me, demanding as he had done before that I told him the location of the shapeshifters, Max Katz and Celia Pels. I refused, of course, and in truth, I didn't know if they had survived the Umbri.
"They did,"
said Finny.
"I have met their granddaughter, Miri."
Granddaughter, ah. So Max and Celia became a couple eventually. I had hoped that would happen. Max had been so sad to leave Esther. I'm glad it all worked out.
"From what I hear,"
said Finny.
"they made it all the way to America."
America? Imagine that.
"So what happened next?"
asked Finny. As we talked, we continued walking through the shadowlands of Umbri. When Alistair didn't get what he wanted from me, he decided to take it out on my family. My kittens and grandkittens bore the brunt of the attacks from the wolves. It started with small skirmishes, and in some cases, like with my feisty grandkittens, it wasn't clear that they didn't enjoy the chase. Finny looked away, but then nodded her head.
"You were right. I became particularly good at hiding here in the maze of shadows."
Ha! You thought I didn't know, but of course I did. I watched you in Umbri. You became an adept shadow traveler. It served you well.
It all came to a head early one spring morning. There had been a full moon on the night before. We had heard howls echoing through the streets of Vienna, and I had warned my cats to stay inside that night. In the morning, though, we thought we would be safe to wander. As usual after a full moon, the wolves laid low and rested. Not this morning. They were waiting for us as we emerged onto the street. They had a strange green fire in their eyes that I'd never seen before, a fire that still haunts my dreams. I believe there was an outside magic at work. For many years, Alistair had employed the alchemist, Quentin Frakes, but his sorcery had been commonplace, a magic not much different to my own. This, on the other hand, was dark and evil. The wolves had lost their reason. They were bent on destroying us once and for all.
The first to emerge from the warehouse that day was my daughter Gertrude. She didn't stand a chance. The wolves were upon her in seconds and tore her to shreds. The rest of us fought hard, but we were outnumbered.
They took my Rachel from me that day. I killed the wolves that attacked her, but it was too late to save my love. My grandkitten Lisa was injured, mauled by the wolves, but I was able to fight them off before they could kill her. I sent her into Umbri with you, Finny. That was the last time I saw any of my family.
I'm so sorry,
said Finny. I retreated into the P.A.W.S headquarters on Glocken Street. Our wards, I believed, were strong, and the wolves couldn't follow me in there unless I invited them, which I had no plans to do. I cried then. They were gone. All gone. I had built this community in Vienna, but now there was nothing left. Alistair would arrive soon, gloating, I could feel it. But part of me wanted to stay there and fight. Have one last showdown with Alistair. But I knew I would lose that fight. So instead, I decided to enter the shadows and follow you and Lisa, but I never found you. May I ask what happened to Lisa? Finny looked away.
I'm sorry. I tried to keep her alive, but she never really recovered from the injuries the wolves afflicted. We made it to Israel, though. She liked that at least she got to see the Holy Land. She wanted that.
That is at least one thing. They stopped in silence now in front of a white stone wall. A silver paw print glowed in the center of the wall. It was good to finally speak with you, Finny. I'm sorry I didn't before.
I understand,
said Finny. She turned to the paw print.
Will I see you again?
No. Rufus has completed his task. All the lost souls have been returned to their homes. I think it is time for me to go on now, to follow my Rachel to the beyond. Goodbye, Finny.
Goodbye, oh Papa.
Finny turned to the silver paw print and placed her paw in the center. The portal expanded, and Finny walked through it without looking back.
And as always, please be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more awesome stories.